Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and it's bad news for Suella Braverman, as if she didn't have enough already. The draconian rules she changed to govern how police manage protests, which essentially meant pretty much any protest, no matter how peaceful, could be broken up and folk arrested for taking part has now formally been ruled unlawful after the government dropped its own case in the High Court. Or specifically the Supreme Court, because the High Court had already said, yeah, this is illegal, mate. So the policing of protests reverts mostly back to before Suella Braverman launched her assault on democratic norms, but vigilance will still be required. We do not want to be following MAGA America here. But first, for daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel to stay notified. So yes, good news and wary news. It's one of those sort of days. In the last couple of years, the Conservatives' period in office, possibly forever, if they don't start to take things seriously, the Tories seem to abandon any hope of winning another election, so they turn their attention to salting the earth for Labour and rolling back democratic norms as much as possible. Part of this effort, led by Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, was to clamp down on peaceful protests, much in the same way as we've seen in America, although with a little bit more subtlety. Don't really think of Braverman as being subtle, do you? But the law says that police can break up protests if they're causing serious disruption. However, Braverman wanted to give the police the power to pretty much stop all protests that were not politically aligned with her government. But although she was able to strip away some protections in legislation that was passed a little while ago, she wasn't able to ban peaceful protests altogether with primary legislation, because that's a bit too unpopular. So she used secondary legislation, which doesn't require a vote by MPs, in order to change the wording for police guidance. Now they would be able to restrict protests if they caused anything more than minor disruption. I mean, protests by their nature are disruptive. It's fair that you don't deny other people's rights to live their lives with a protest, but a protest has to be by its nature disruptive to some degree. You've got to draw attention to yourself. Otherwise, it's not really much of a protest. If you're trying to move through town and there's a large protest taking place, if it means you have to walk around it, that's fine. If you are impeded completely, okay, that's not so fine. But the new guidance meant that the police could break up protests for the flimsiest of reasons. I've got to walk around them. Oh dear, don't worry, we'll break up the protest. People at the time tried to point out that, look, people will protest when they're not happy. If you take away their right to legally and peacefully protest, what do you think is going to happen? You're just criminalising people for no reason. In America, Trump is creating the conditions for this question to be answered at some point. We're not quite half a year into his return and we're already talking about civil war in serious tones. Fortunately, we can step back a bit in the UK. Liberty, the human rights group, had been taking the government to court in the belief that secondary legislation wasn't an appropriate way of changing the law for this. They'd begun the action whilst the Conservatives were in power, and Labour also continued to fight the case after they won the election. But they have now dropped the challenge. It means that the legal process, which was already finding in Liberty's favour, now ends, and Braverman shenanigans, at least in this respect, have been cancelled. It means anyone who was arrested according to the previous guidance was arrested unlawfully. Some, such as Greta Thunberg, had already challenged their arrest in court and won separately. So a step towards restoring some of the democratic norms damaged by the Tories. Well, let's hope so. The problem here is not necessarily that the government cannot further restrict the right to peaceful protest. It's that they did it unconstitutionally. Peaceful protests cannot actually be banned completely. That would conflict with our obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights, which is another reason why Farage and an increasing number of Tories want to see us withdraw, so that when they return to power, they can crush dissent just as Trump is attempting in America, without the courts being bothersome. But those in favour of the tighter restrictions want the government to now implement them, but properly, with primary legislation. Now, ordinarily, you would say, well, look, this isn't going to happen, is it? Labour opposed the more draconian aspects of the Public Order Act and had said that they would seek to tone them down with guidance when in power, as they wouldn't have the parliamentary time to amend it without jeopardising their main policies, right? However, they did try to fight this case until now. I think they've only dropped it because they knew they were going to lose. They're also having policies directed by Blue Labour, who are taking a very strongly conservative view on most social issues, which is sort of, that's fine. There's a chunk of Labour that are like that. My problem is that they are getting 100% of the say. And despite Starmer initially saying that he wouldn't be pursuing performative policies, well, there have already been some performative policies adopted, some of which have had to be dropped because they've been a disaster. Being clear, when people cite examples of protests that have gone too far, this change in police guidance makes no difference, by the way. See, it was the antics of Extinction Rebellion which boosted public support for a tightening of restrictions on protests, but all of the disruptive tactics used by them were already covered by other legislation. They were already illegal, and they remain illegal. There's not a single example of what the public would agree was a stunt going too far, for which it would be suddenly lawful with this reversal of the policing rules. You know, throwing paint at something, that's criminal damage. Blocking traffic, obstruction of the highway. Laws we've had for a long time already allow police to intervene in acts which go too far like that. The Home Office have talked about bringing in new legislation, but this is to cover intimidatory protests outside places of worship, you know, such as those that took place outside mosques before kicking off the riots last summer. There's nothing more proposed as far as I can tell. So the Home Office are not giving any indication that they've got any interest in resurrecting ideas from Suella Braverman. But as the government did continue the defence of her changes in court, it might be worth just being a bit wary when new legislation is presented to Parliament. But in the here and now, the rules revert back to the way they were. The police cannot restrict a protest that does not cause serious disruption. And legally speaking, serious disruption, there's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but tends to mean completely stopping people or groups going about their day-to-day business. It doesn't mean you can't make things a bit awkward. It just means you cannot stop them completely. You can't hamper the delivery of time-sensitive products or essential goods and services. Basically, your right to protest does not give you the right to deny someone else their rights to carry out lawful activities. But you can hinder them as long as not too seriously. The police can't break up a protest just because someone else is inconvenienced and has to walk a few metres to go around. And as Liberty have said, anyone who was funnelled into the criminal justice system as a result of Braverman's rules change, which the High Court had already ruled never lawfully existed, should be able to have any arrests or convictions voided. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And for more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.